Hello and welcome to the Faith Response to Gender-Based Violence, the first session of the Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence's three-part series for people interested in learning more about the intersections of faith-based advocacy and gender-based violence. This discussion is being recorded and it will be emailed to everyone who registered for the session. In the chat, please put your name. I already mentioned this, if you're an intern, where you're interning or what organization you're related to and where you're joining us from, so we kind of get a sense of who's here today. Those who attend all three sessions and complete a survey following each session will receive a certificate of completion. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and a transcription should be available during the meeting. If you have any questions about that or how to access that, put it in the chat. And I will address that when I'm done speaking. Before we hear from our incredible panelists and members of the Interfaith Coalition, I want to introduce myself and the coalition generally. My name is Dorian Karp, and I'm the Advocacy and Policy Director at Jewish Women International. Today, I would like to acknowledge that I'm working from my home outside of Washington, D.C., a home which sits on the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, past and present. Acknowledging the land we each sit on is one way to continue honoring Indigenous people going forward. I will add in the chat the resource I use to find this information when I'm done. JWI's focus and mission is to empower women and girls and end gender-based violence. We do this work in secular, interfaith, and Jewish spaces. JWI first convened the Interfaith Coalition in 2007, and now represents nearly 40 faith-based organizations who come together to work to end violence against women and girls, with a focus mainly on impacting and effectuating change through federal legislative advocacy. This month, we're hosting this three-part series to help inform and provide a landscape of the work being done at the intersection of faith, advocacy, and work to end gender-based violence. Today, our panelists will be speaking to the Jewish, Muslim, and Catholic faith responses to gender-based violence, and more specifically to domestic violence. When we talk about domestic violence, we are of course talking about the physical violence that's associated with it, but I wanted to reiterate that it's more expansive than that. What we're really talking about is a pattern of behavior involving the use or attempted use of physical, sexual, verbal, psychological, economic, or even technological abuse, or any other coercive behavior like spiritual abuse, committed, enabled, or solicited to gain or maintain power and control over a victim. On our panel today is Deborah Rosenblum, the Chief Program Officer at Jewish Women International, Dr. Denise Berthe, the Executive Director of Peaceful Families Project, Dr. Sharon O'Brien, the Director of Catholics for Family Peace, and Ben Wortham, the Vice President for Behavioral Health Integration at Catholic Charities USA. I am now done talking and will turn it over to my colleague and friend, Deborah Rosenblum, to kick us off today.
Thank you, Dorian, and thank you to each of you for being here and taking the time to learn about our work. And to my colleagues on this panel and to all the individual and organizational members of the Interfaith Coalition as a whole, it's a privilege to work together and learn from you. People of faith experience domestic violence in all the same ways as people who may not align as significantly with their faith, but there are also some unique characteristics. There's spiritual abuse, when ritual is used to abuse and control the victim by either saying you're not doing enough or not letting the person do the rituals and obey the religious law that she believes in, and that's an integral part of her life. There's misusing or misreading religious texts and law for their benefit to say that they are the dominant person in the relationship, and this is what the religious law requires. And there's feeling marginalized by their communities. Now, I am certain that survivors of any survivor will feel marginalized by their communities because we're just not at the place yet where survivors are accepted by their communities as wholeheartedly as we would like them to be and as they need to be. In the Jewish community specifically, the community itself is fairly insular and highly networked. The Jewish community represents about less really than 2% of the American population. It's heavily organized and everyone seems to know each other or to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. So there's incredible feelings of shame when someone is a victim of domestic violence, of feeling like, where do I go? Who is going to believe me? What have I done? What have I done? Of blaming herself, and I'm saying herself because often the victim is a woman, although obviously not in all cases, and of feeling that she's brought shame to the community by being less than a perfect wife and not fulfilling her role. Being a good wife and being part of a family is a core value of being part of the Jewish community, which itself is difficult, often as a barrier, but feeling that you're not doing enough to support the family and to being that model wife can be really difficult. One of the Jewish community's core values is called Shalom Bayit, which means translated literally, it's called domestic harmony. And often that role is seen to fall on the wife in the relationship. It's her role, it's her job to be the one who brings Shalom Bayit, who facilitates that Shalom Bayit, who's meeting the needs of everyone else to ensure that there is that domestic harmony. And when that doesn't happen, when she is experiencing domestic violence, there's this incredible feeling of shame. And because it's so highly networked and organized, everybody seems to know about it. And then who wants to play with her children? Who wants to marry her children? Who wants to have her over for family meals, for holiday meals? People don't seem to want to be with that person. And that's a huge barrier and a really difficult situation for that person to be in. There's about 40 domestic violence programs which are funded by the Jewish community across the country. Often these are part of what we call the Jewish Family Services programs, which are part of the federations, which do much of the work within the local communities. But many of these programs are also separate and just standalone domestic violence programs created in order to provide specific support to Jewish victims and their children. Recently, just a few months ago, JWI completed a large report, a survey of a needs assessment to learn about the unmet needs and gaps in services within these Jewish programs and the clients that they serve. And currently we are working on responding to those unmet needs that were identified. Like most other survivors, the biggest gaps are around legal services. Lawyers are expensive, cases are complicated, and cases take a very long time. One of the biggest issues in the legal arena is around custody of children. There's huge issues around that, and also around financial abuse and really the destruction of any kind of good credit or any ability to be economically secure, which has repercussions across the lifetime also. And then housing, specifically housing within the Jewish community, is difficult for victims, for Jewish victims. They want to live within the Jewish community, and it's difficult to access. And it's important for Jews to live in community because in community there are the synagogues, there's the resources, there's the friends, there's the kosher butcher, there's the bakery, there's all the things that being community gives you. And there's friends and family. So people want to stay in community, but housing within the community is incredibly difficult to access often if people don't have resources. But what we also learned, and the part that we're really trying to work on, and I think that JWI can move the needle on this, is the lack of true community support. Survivors told us that they don't feel welcome, they're ashamed, and that the challenges of remaining in the community for a person of faith are extremely difficult. If her faith community abandons her at this critically vulnerable time, where does she go? If the faith community that she so strongly believes in and so identifies with doesn't support her, what does she do? In a 2009 fatality review conducted by the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, it found that the first professional that 1 out of 5 survivors turned to was their faith leader. And we know what courage that must take. But what if the faith leader doesn't know how to respond, doesn't believe the victim, blames the victim, and privileges the abuser, who may be a male, who may be a quote unquote important man within the community, who may be an important donor, who might be the person who's chairing the board of which the faith leader is an employee? there's all sorts of ways where that faith leader needs to overcome those barriers and support and believe the victim. And what we tell faith leaders, what we encourage them is just believe, just listen and believe the victim and support her in that way. So our job at JWI is to provide training and resources for rabbis who are the spiritual leaders of the Jewish community, and cantors who provide the beautiful music prayer services at the synagogues, to seminary students who are studying to become those roles, and to the community leadership, to encourage them to use their stature and their access to people to speak around relationships, to send a strong message that it's not okay, and to be sure that they're not privileging male donors or male leaders who are abusers. In 2003, we did a study and we asked clergy, rabbis specifically, if any of their members of their congregations were victims or survivors of domestic violence. And many of them said no. And we're like, wow, that's incredible. So tell us, have you ever indicated that you're a safe person to come out to share with, to reveal? Have you ever indicated in any way that you know what domestic violence is? Have you ever indicated in any way that you've had training or that you know the DV advocate? They all said no. And said, try that. Go back, give what we call a Dvar Torah, a word of Torah, a word of Bible, a sermon about relationships, bring in domestic violence, put a poster on your wall and see what happens. And they did. And then lo and behold, people came forward. We said, they're there. But until you send that message that you're a safe person to come out to, they're not going to come forward, and they shouldn't. In our survey, we learned that most of the rabbis have experience with domestic violence, but they want more training. And our clergy task force on domestic abuse in the Jewish community, which we founded in 2008, will be providing increased trainings over the coming year and is producing new resources to address these issues. We're just we're soon releasing a resource for rabbis to use in premarital counseling. We're releasing resources for rabbis to use when doing funerals where the decedent is an abuser, in a very difficult position for the family to be. How do you mourn that person? What is that like? And we have a clergy guide, which is available on our website, which helps rabbis and cantors understand the red flags and the barriers to coming forward, because their role at that moment is a life-saving role. If they don't believe the victim, if they don't say, I believe you, I hear you, I'm here to help you, tell me how I can help, we don't know where that victim will be. Our role is also to increase awareness within the Jewish community and to provide healthy relationship prevention workshops for teens and young adults within Jewish organizations. And there are so many Jewish organizations. We have summer camps, and we have national youth groups, and we have trips, and we have service organizations. There's so many ways and so many places for this programming to be provided. And importantly, to work with secular advocates to help them connect with Jewish leadership in the community and to build those relationships. We have around 40, as I said, around 40 domestic violence programs serving the Jewish community, but often Jews don't want to actually go there because, as I said, we all know each other. You don't want to be that person walking into the Jewish domestic violence program. Everybody's like, wait, where'd she go? Who did I see in the building? Where'd she go? And that has happened to people. So often now these programs will be in other places outside of the main Federation building where a lot of the Jewish organizations are housed, in some more anonymous location. But people still feel that shame. And so they don't want to be part of that Jewish program and although the resources there are really specifically for them, they may feel that it's not the right place to get services. And I want to add that what we learned and what we knew actually from Jewish Family Services is that the bulk actually of the clients are not Jewish. They're everyone in the community, anyone in the community is welcome and does make use of the Jewish Family Services domestic violence programs, which we think is a wonderful thing. But Jews may turn to secular programs for help because there might be less shame there. But one of the things that we also learned was that advocates don't always necessarily understand what that person went through because there's some kind of myth that this doesn't happen in Jewish communities for a variety of reasons. And so part of the work that we do is to help secular advocates know that this does, and for them to be able to recognize also those red flags and not to minimize them, and to understand the significant barriers that a Jewish woman might have in coming forward. And they need to build the relationships with the clergy, with the Jewish community, because the Jewish community is not going to seek them out. They need to go and build those relationships. And that can be scary. Like, how do you suddenly call a rabbi? I'm so-and-so, and I want to talk to Rabbi so-and-so about domestic violence, which isn't something we totally talk about so openly. So we try to help bridge those gaps, to create those connections, and to create really strong working relationships, so that when a domestic violence victim does turn to her clergy leader, her spiritual leader, he or she knows that she can pick up the phone and say, I'm suggesting to a member of my congregation that he or she turn to you for help, and they'll be doing that when they're ready to do that. And we want the advocates to know that they can count on the clergy if there's spiritual needs of the victims that they want to honor. For example, lighting Sabbath candles on a Friday night is something that's important to many Jews, and so there may not be the space in the shelter to do that. But how can we make that happen? Maybe it's using electric lights instead of candlelight because it's safer. Maybe the person is kosher and needs a certain kind of food. But what does that mean? It sounds like, I don't know what that means. How do I ensure that this person has the food? They can call the rabbi and ask them to help them figure it out. So they need to understand what some of those issues might be that the Jewish victim might be needing, those services specifically that the Jewish victim might be needing. We believe that the faith community can be an incredible life-saving support for survivors, or it can turn the other cheek and ignore or blame them or minimize their realities. And what our work is to ensure that the faith community is that life-saving support. And I want to share with you that years ago, JWI is now part of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. But years ago, we weren't as welcome at that space because faith was seen as a barrier instead of as a resource. And we're really trying, and I think we're fairly successful as a community, and with this IC, with all of your work together, to say faith can be a resource, can be a support. And it's critical that it is, because when we're vulnerable, who do we turn to as people of faith? We turn to our faith communities. We need them, and we want them, and we expect them to be there. And they will be there, and they can be there if we are helpful to them in understanding the issues that we're facing. So I'm happy to share the needs assessment report with you. I think Dorian will put a link to it in the chat. We also have resources under our clergy work. There's a clergy guide, there's webinars, there's other resources. We have some prayers, and you're all welcome to look at them, make use of them, and to contact me if you're more curious about what's going on in the Jewish community's response to domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And I'll make sure to put some of that information, those websites, into the chat. Now we will turn it over to Dr. Denise Birthday.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dorian and the coalition, for pulling this together. I also will follow Dorian's lead and speaking from Philadelphia, which is the historic land of the Lenape. Also, as someone who is in exile from Palestine, everywhere my feet are is Palestine. And I want to talk a little bit about Peaceful Families Project, what we do, the different ways that we engage the community, what our community looks like, and also very cursorily explain sort of the Muslim position on domestic violence, which I think there's a fair amount of confusion, there's a fair amount of misunderstanding about in the sort of the mainstream community. So Peaceful Family Programs has been around for about 20 years. It is the first and really still only Muslim-based national organization addressing prevention and awareness around domestic violence. And we do not do direct services, although we support direct service communities and populations and advocates across the country. Our job really is to create curriculum, to create programming, we have trainers across the country. We have 20 trainers across the country for adults, and we're working with a new set of trainers around youth as well. So the core programs of Peaceful Family Project have to do with training. A lot of and I'll talk a little bit about diversity. So one of the things that we do really has to do with diversity. The Muslim community, according to the latest Pew statistics, is the most diverse community within the religious faith communities, right? Part of that is because the way that Islam was brought to the United States, it started out actually with the African American community, which for whom it was sort of a political movement. And then, of course, we have immigrants from around the world. About 63% of Muslims at this point are still first generation. So a lot of what we do is about access. Linguistically, when we do programming, and I invite you all to go onto our website, it has amazing resources. But when we do even a PSA, we have to go to about 14 different languages in terms of really offering complete access to our community. So we do a lot with cultural understanding, because we are all one people in terms of faith, but not all one people in terms of culture. We also have to work with linguistics. A lot of our folks are newcomers to the United States, not all, but a lot of them are. So we have to make sure that we have access for linguistics, and then also for our religious leaders who may also have come from another country initially. A lot of our work then is around training. We do training both for religious leaders. We have the only national imam training that happens annually, and we work with religious leaders across the country. We also have our training of trainers. So we do have 20 trainers across the country at the moment, and then do that annually as well, so that cadre grows. We also do trainings within communities, as well as, and I thank Deborah as well, talking about training with mainstream providers, because we do have about 25 Muslim-based shelters. Most of our women, however, do not go to shelter, and we'll talk a little bit about models as well, models that work within diverse and marginalized populations that are different than sort of models that have historically been used for domestic violence. So we do have Muslim-based shelters, but for the most part, a lot of our folks are living in small communities where they do not have access to Muslim-based services, so they end up in mainstream services. A lot of what we do is working with mainstream service providers to make their services more accessible to all sorts of victims, including Muslim victims. So we work with training on all of those levels. We have a resource department. So if you go onto our website, there are multiple resources for religious leaders in terms of very similar to what we heard previously, in terms of how do we insert a conversation about domestic violence into our regular Friday worship. How do we bring this up? How do religious leaders bring this up when they're asked to counsel specific families and such? So we have written resources for imams and religious leaders. We also have a domestic violence toolkit for survivors themselves, because again, a lot of our folks are not in what we call Muslim population hubs. Are surrounded by lots of other Muslims. So we need to get them sort of connected virtually and in other kinds of ways. So we have virtual, both written and verbal, because again, some percent of our victims are not either literate in English or even in language of origin. The third piece that we do is research, and this is really important in terms of making sure that voices of marginalized populations are in what we consider for best practice. So a lot of our work, Peaceful Families did the first sort of national survey for domestic violence in 2011. There is a new one going out this summer in terms of grabbing what is the experience of domestic violence within Muslim communities in the United States. We also work with individual researchers, either for recruitment, forced marriage. We're working right now on a group with male allyship, youth curriculums. All of these kinds of things are part of our research program. And really it is because we are science-based. We want to have best practice, and we know that best practice is not complete if it does not have the voices of all of the populations involved, including linguistically, faith tradition, race, color, culture, all of the above. So a lot of what we do is to to hold up that piece nationally. We also have a section around affiliated partnerships. So we are also the sponsor of Manavdi, which is the Muslim Advocate Domestic Violence Network, which pulls together advocates from all over the country and internationally for an annual conference, for trainings, we have monthly meetings so that they can know each other and really look at different models of service that make sense for our particular population, for our particular samples. On top of that, we now have about 4 new programs that have started in the past few months. One is, I talked about, is allyship. We know that we cannot get anywhere within any of our faith communities, much less the larger community, if we are female advocates talking to female victims. That really, this is about cultural change. It's about the way that we're looking at things, and we must include male allies. So we have a male allyship program that has, we have a peaceful partner pledge, which is something that we have our male allies sign on to and educate each other about. We have our Fabulous Fathers of Faith, which is really uplifting good examples, because we also can't just shake fingers at people and say, you know, you all do this or you all do that. So we uplift positive role models within our communities, as well as building a curriculum. We are now building a curriculum and a social media campaign, really looking at, because our job is prevention, not only intervention, really looking at how do we change the ways that communities look at domestic violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of our religious base of after I go through the programs. On top of that, we have a peaceful parenting program, which looks at, of course, parenting without violence, which is a little bit about child abuse, but also a little bit about the hierarchical ways that sometimes families are set up, and really giving folks another tool, giving them more than one tool, giving them various tools on how do we do parenting when power and control are taken out of the picture, that not based on, you know, threatening and physical discipline, but all of the different ways that we can engage our families and also teach positive behaviors. We have a youth curriculum called Peaceful Futures, which gathers, we know that folks do not start sort of their way of looking at the world and their relationship building as adults. That really starts at a young age. So we have programs for middle school, high school, and then college age folks around how do we build peaceful relationships and how do we build peaceful families from a very young age. On top of that, we have Peaceful World, which is our global programs where we take our curriculum around the world, and peaceful parting. So one of the beautiful things that we have in Islam is that divorce is part of our tradition, and even our Prophet, peace be upon him, was divorced more than once. So for us, divorce is a very sort of open option, but some folks culturally and just because of their own limitations have a difficulty with that. So it's a program that looks at how to make divorce and co-parenting a peaceful process. One of our cores is that all of our work is based on a positive preventive model that is not about, and we heard this from Deborah too, thank you so much, about the idea that you have to leave your faith, or that faith is an obstacle to work with domestic violence. And what we know is within our faith tradition, it was created, believe it or not, some of you are going to be shocked by this, but it was really created to make a balance for women in vulnerable populations. Now, what the mainstream world has on that, where some of our cultures may fall apart on that really, for us, it's not moving away from our faith tradition, but moving really much more closely into our faith tradition. Within the Muslim faith tradition, the goal of marriage is sakina, is to create safe places, is to create sanctuary so that individuals, partners, and their children can do what they need to do in society in terms of being productive, in terms of education. And that is the only goal, despite what grandmothers might tell us. It is not about making grandchildren. It is not about building wealth or houses. The Quran, our verses within the Quran state that the goal of marriage is sakina, is to create peaceful places, which is beautiful for us because that way we can always go back to the Quran. It's not us, it's just what the Quran says. The fact that we are born not in some of our other Abrahamic traditions, but we are born not from the rib, but the same soul. So within the Quran, we don't have the story of Adam and Eve and the apple in terms of Eve sort of, tempting somebody to eat an apple. We are born of the same soul. We are provided equal rights and roles within the family, that our only loyalty within the family is to Allah, is to God. So we have so much strength within our scripture. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times we have to educate our own population and then the mainstream population as well, as to that's really what we say and that's really who we are, as opposed to some of the cultural misinterpretations that have happened in different places and in different communities around the world, which are really a misuse, this idea of spiritual abuse, where verses were taken out and really sort of muddled up and sort of applied differentially than what really the tradition says. So a lot of what we do is re-educating, going back to our Quran and the Hadith being the stories of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the way that he was, and the way that he managed life, and the way that the role model that we have in all of our prophets, but certainly in the Prophet Muhammad, our last prophet, peace be upon him, the way that he managed his marriages, his children, all of those kinds of things. So we really go back to our tradition as opposed to moving away from our tradition. We, of course, do service with Muslim communities, with Muslim-based service providers, some of whom, again, do not have the education/advocacy background, that they have the best of intentions, they start programming. So there's a lot of work that we do with them. And then we work with mainstream service providers who are called to serve Muslim communities. We work looking at all of those sort of pieces at the national level. We have, so if you go onto our website or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, we have a national directory for domestic violence providers across the country, as well as having what we call our domestic violence tea talks, or domestic violence sort of 101 sessions in about 6 languages at this point. So we work really to create that access for everyone. And then of course we have our affiliations at the national level. We're so excited always to work with our interfaith partners, knowing that we have so much more in common than we have in terms of diversity when we're talking about faith traditions and domestic violence. And I will pass this off, I believe, to Sharon.
Sharon, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Denise and Deborah, for leading us off, and Dorian for always coordinating our efforts. What our Jewish and Muslim colleagues and this Christian response, we always find that we have so much more in common, which is what Denise just said. But today, my colleague Ben Wortham from the Catholic Charities USA and I are going to do a slightly different approach, because if you come back on for the 3rd session on July 22nd, we will do our description of our particular national group, Catholics for Family Peace. We are the folks who help the 196 dioceses across the country to create a coordinated, compassionate, informed response to domestic abuse. But today we're going to give you a bit of a history about the Christian response to domestic abuse. Ben's going to pick up by giving an example about the importance of case managers in housing programs. Both Deborah and Denise, I think, mentioned that each of their faiths, and certainly Christians, are big on this whole effort to provide housing for people. And then he will conclude with a survey about our agencies that provide domestic abuse. I don't know if we can do a quick survey with people, but the as you can see from both the Jewish and the Muslim presentation, people of faith, I think all people, but people of faith in particular, are concerned about people suffering abuse. So I'm fascinated to kind of know whether you've ever heard a homily or a sacred talk, or whatever your tradition might refer to it as, because even though I liked how my colleagues made the point that our faiths are crystal clear, that people need to be respected, that we are born in equal dignity. I mean, the faith community doesn't have an issue with it theoretically. The issue comes with in living in a secular world, right? Kind of the cultural aspect, and having the courage to say, I don't care if it's been, historically accepted that you treat a spouse this way. And our faith makes it clear that it is not acceptable. And that takes a lot of courage. It takes so much courage that organizationally, as far as we know, organizationally, none of our faiths, I might be wrong about this for my Jewish and Muslim colleagues, but organizationally, 1975 was the start of what became known as Faith Trust Institute. It's an international multi-faith, multicultural program. So if you are interested in this topic, I encourage you to check out Faith Trust Institute. Both they started with a heavy influence with both our Jewish and Muslim colleagues. They have wonderful videos for both of their faiths, and because Christianity is just so broad, it's been a little more of a challenge to get into the game here. But Deborah mentioned that the Jewish population in the U.S. is around 2%. The Christian population in the U.S. is 65%, down from 85% in 1990. So the majority of U.S. People who identify with the faith still identify as Christians, but thank goodness there's much more. There is much more people know other people of faith, and organizationally there's a lot of interfaith work, a lot of collaboration. But I do want to say that so if we think about 1975 being this kind of the organizational start. So if you're tracking this, so we have that, the Faith Trust Institute. We then came along, it was called POSH, Peace and Safety in the Christian Home. And isn't that exactly what Deborah and Denise just talked about? That the essence of all this is about peace and safety. I mean, if you can't be, wars are absolutely terrible, but if you can't be peaceful and safe in your own home, I mean, that's a real problem. So peace and safety in the Christian home very much took a Protestant, it was founded by a Protestant evangelical, and did great work, wonderful book around women and abuse in the Bible. So I'd recommend that to you. We can send out some of these links afterwards. But in 2006, there was a study of 18 major denominations about what they said. What do they put in print about domestic violence? And it was, from Mennonites to Baptists to, of course, the three of us. People on paper say, oh, this is what we believe in peace and safety in the home. Making it happen is another story, of course. But I always like to point to, so that study was done in 2006. This Interfaith Coalition started in 2007. And as Dorian said, we have 40 members. So there are, if you have any doubt about whether your faith community or you're curious about some faith community, about whether they're interested in addressing this issue, we can pretty much ensure you that they are, but do follow up with us, because faith communities, so we care about people from the womb to the tomb, right? I mean, this whole business about community support. I do want to highlight that for Christians, the domestic violence is naturally it's an issue, but it's hard to figure out because divorce is tricky for Christians. We have a whole section so Ephesians 5 about submission and headship. Much like Deborah and Denise said, abusers are very gifted at twisting a sacred text, because if they read the entire, I invite anyone to read the entire section of Ephesians 5 and see if they could live up to giving their life for their beloved. It's like, you have to read the whole thing. You can't just pick out one line. So divorce is tricky for Christians. It kind of varies across the broad, I mean, there are a lot of Christian groups, so I won't comment about everybody. Divorce, the marriage promises, the whole business about submission, headship. Forgiveness is a huge issue in the Christian community because obviously our Jewish and Muslim colleagues forgive also, but Christians feel like we feel like we're bound to forgive. But what we need to do, we need to do lots of education around how, fine, forgiveness is one thing, but forgiveness is not reconciliation. And it is not saying that you have to live with the person. And it's not saying that what was done was okay. So the Christians have much to fiddle with, but we're very similar to what Deborah and Denise said. And if you come back on July 23rd, you'll hear about all of our programs as well. But I'm going to let Ben talk about the importance of this case management, because depending on, we really appreciate people telling us where you're from, but because you all seem to have a social heart, right? You're concerned about the community. And then we'll talk about our survey, and then we'll be open for question and answers. So Ben, please.
Yep, thanks, Sharon. I'm going to share the screen real quick, talk off a couple slides real quick. So this is, you can see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So this is how I learned the magnitude of what Catholic Charities is nationwide. So we have 167 member agencies, at least one Catholic Charities in every state. Last year served 13 million people. I'm one of the 41,000 employees. And last year took in 4.9 billion, but put 4.7 billion back into the US, into the poor and vulnerable. So this is so I worked at Catholic Charities New Orleans for 7 years, helping to develop healthcare and housing programs for the homeless. This is a picture that I took. We go into the encampments. I wanted to bring this up because one of the takeaways when I was thinking about this is, of all the years we were in these encampments, the homeless women almost were never by themselves, almost never. I'd say 99% of the time they were with a guy in a relationship. And part of the thinking is, and these relationships were not good, but part of the thinking is when the women would hit the streets and become homeless, that they would get basically preyed upon, but they would also need somebody to protect them. So in this like survival tactic, they'd end up in these awful relationships that we would see out on the streets. And so that just got me thinking when I was thinking about this yesterday. And so I looked up domestic violence stats on women who become homeless. So this was something I was sent today. This is just in general, 1 out of 4 women, 1 out of 7 men have experienced severe physical violence in an intimate relationship, kicked, beaten, choked, burned, weapon used against them. That's not homeless, that's just in general. So then it just gets, 50% of US cities surveyed reported domestic violence as a primary cause of homelessness for women. 56% of women in homeless shelters reported they had been victims of domestic violence. 83% of survivors reported having difficulty finding suitable, affordable housing. 92% of homeless women had experienced severe physical and or sexual assault at some time in their lives. So that all of that's pretty staggering to me, and what you see out in the homeless world. This is another place in Catholic Charities New Orleans that I worked in for a couple of years. This is 109 apartments that we housed with formerly homeless individuals. I'd say maybe 10 to 15% were formerly chronically homeless women, which means they were homeless for at least a year, sometimes 5, 10, 15 years before we housed them. So just very traumatic situations and lives before they moved in here. And I just want to make the point here that it's not that you just take somebody who's experienced domestic violence and been homeless and put them in an apartment and call it good. The idea here is that it's called permanent supportive housing, and it's on those supports. So I was one of the support staff for the people who moved in with all these traumatic events. So to simplify it, this is really what you need when somebody moves out of homelessness and has experienced domestic violence. It's a combination of healthcare, housing, and social services is sort of how we look at it. So you need access to each one of these in the bubble to really lift somebody back up. This is a really cool slide that I love. This is my health. This is your health. This is a homeless person's health. The takeaway here is that when you look at this, of what makes up your health, 40% of what makes you a healthy person has to do with social determinants of health. So education, employment, income, social support, all of those things that somebody who's homeless in domestic violence situation is not receiving. So another way to look at it is through the Catholic Charities lens, because we offer 1,500 programs, and these are the social determinants of health. And this is just another way to look at that slide. So 50% of your health is social determinants of health. So it's not about just housing and providing counseling. It's about housing, providing counseling, helping them with employment, education, trying to link them back up with their family, transportation. It really takes case management, like Sharon was mentioning. So anyways, just moving on quickly. We didn't know very much since I came to Catholic Charities USA 2 years ago. There was no information really about what was going on with domestic violence services across the country. So Sharon helped me craft Sharon really crafted it. I put it together in SurveyMonkey, and we got information back from the network. So we had 61 responses. We called it the Catholic Sponsored DV Response Services Survey. So does your agency offer clinical services to survivors? So we have 38 agencies across the country that do that, which was great. And these are some of the services. Groups, counseling, that was listed in the survey. They typed these out. I just put them in. Does your agency offer abuser intervention programs? And so 17 programs offer that to abusers. And these are some of the interventions that came back from the survey by those 17 agencies: transitional housing, medical clinics, groups. And does your agency manage domestic violence shelters for survivors and children? And we had 13 agencies that manage domestic violence shelters for survivors and children. And then 36 agencies that provide clinical services to children who've experienced or witnessed caregivers' harmful behavior. And those are some of them. I think that was just 5 or maybe a little over. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So the point we want to make to you as interns and interested people is that people of faith, certainly Jewish, Muslim, Christian, we're concerned about this issue. And thank goodness we have Dorian's group where we gather monthly and can figure out, what can we do to help matters. Dorian?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Denise and Sharon and Ben for sharing, and Deborah again. We have about 9 minutes. So, I could ask a lot of questions of the speakers, even though this is work that I do. But I want to turn it over if there are any questions from any of the participants. Either put it in the chat, raise your hands, go off mute. I will stop talking for about 20 seconds to allow time. Okay, maybe everybody just did a great job, and now everybody knows all there is to know about faith response to domestic violence. Sorry, Sharon.
No, that's fine. I was going to say, if people want to turn on their videos, if they're available, maybe we could, and you could give us some feedback about whether you have ever heard a homily or heard anyone in your faith community or your neighbor's faith community talk about domestic violence. The three of us are always fascinated by that answer, because we do a lot of clergy training. So, and we contend that hardly anybody hears it. But if
And actually, as we do that, Ben, actually, I have a question for you, because you got me really excited about a thought and a different way of looking at something.
All
And
right.
that was transitional housing for perpetrators, because one of the difficulties we know is women and children not wanting to leave their spaces, not being able to leave their homes. But to be honest, and I worked internationally, like all over the place, the idea of having transitional housing for men, so there's a place for perpetrators to go during an order of protection or such, is an amazing idea. How does that work?
That I'm not totally sure. I really don't know. But we can definitely do some research and find out who put that on the survey and get back to you. Is that, I don't know.
That's amazing. Plus now I just have that popcorn thing in my head, and I was like, what a great solution.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll ask Deborah. I heard years ago, 20 years ago at a conference, that in Israel, that's a classic technique, is you send the person using abuse out of the house to a housing, so to a group house. They live together. You may not.
I'm not familiar with that, but
Okay.
I have heard, and I'm not sure if it's true, but I've heard that in England, that's the idea. That's how abusers are. And so that's something we could research. So the locks are changed. And why should the victim survivor be the one to suddenly either be homeless or have to stay with family on the couch, like all those things.
Right.
Instead, it's the abuser who leaves. So I'm not sure if it's true, but it's something that we should totally look into.
Yeah, sounds great. Good. And
I like the idea that having them live with each other, because I just feel like that would be a whole dynamic. That would be so much like.
I mean, the thing what I've heard about, like batteries interventions groups and all that they learn from each other. So it might not always be positive, because then it could be like you're learning more techniques about how to abuse and kind of reinforcing each other's behavior. So I would want to look into that. I'd be very interested, Ben, if you could help us learn more about that and how it works.
And we do have a contact, Catholic Charities in Michigan. They run a international Friday at 2 p.m. conversation with professionals who do work with people who abuse. So we'll be able to get that answer pretty quickly.
Right. And I actually did. One of my jobs was to be the punishment for Spanish speaking men who abused in Delaware for a fair amount of time. And to be honest, it was a really fascinating. It really was. It isn't sort of what you imagine, you know, with the idea of hurting people, with the idea of almost everyone in those groups had a history of domestic violence within their childhood. It really was. And even me, I'm like, you know, very strong, but it was very different work than I imagined it to be honest. But the idea of sort of different models, because we know that for many women of faith, I just had this conversation yesterday, that women of faith are not necessarily asking to end their marriages, especially, you know, they want to be married, they just don't want to be physically, you know, sexually and emotionally abused. So how do we really make that work? So that idea, that's why I'm always kind of looking for sort of a spin on how we make things really for victims.
And I think that's one of the complexities around domestic violence. We've spoken to so many survivors who say, I love that person, and they do. And they don't want the relationship to end, they want the abuse to end. So how do you come to that? But something, Denise, that you just said reminded me of something else, which is that, you know, we know that people who grow up in homes where there is this violence may tend toward being either the victim or the abuser. And that's a terrible thing to think about. And what kind of, you know, if you're that parent or that grandparent or whatever, like to think this is inevitable, and it's not inevitable. And what we need to do is to help and to provide more resources to children and the work around children to help them be resilient and to help them change that dynamic, because that would be terrible that your fate was decided in that moment.
Right.
I actually life trajectory.
No, I actually did my dissertation on that very topic because
I told me that.
And it turned, you know, so a woman who grows up in an abusive home, you know, it was thought that, okay, you know, it's a done deal. You know, you might as well dig your grave now. Thankfully, the research didn't bear that out. I contributed to the fact that women know no pain. It's like, okay, let me avoid that. What was a determining factor is whether he grew up in an abusive home. So that was interesting. I do, if Dorian's going to cut us off here in 30 seconds, I do want to lift up Katie Ruth, who put in the chat that she's a master's student, but at Temple, but with the, you're with the United Lutheran Seminary. So what we're excited about, and my Jewish and Muslim colleagues have more success than we do. Well, that's not fair. But anyway, to doing clergy training, because we do think that that's absolutely key. I mean, people, this is not a difficult marriage. I mean, that's true. It's not, it's more than a difficult marriage. It's more than a horrible marriage. It is an illegal, immoral, unethical, painful marriage, which needs to be resolved and needs to be addressed. So helping clergy realize that it only looks like a marriage. That's not really a marriage going on. So, but Katie, that's great if you have a connection with the United Lutheran Seminary. Lutherans are great about this. Seventh-day Adventists, most everybody has a go-to office. So feel free, people on the
Right,
call.
I was going to say I'm a Temple alum, so excited to see that Temple connection. I'm also right now local in Philly, so if you need any support, let me know. It's I have worked in the past with multi faith leaders, and I do think for us, I think that change of definition, what we've done is really present domestic violence as a human rights issue, that this is not about marriage at all. This is about oppression, simply. And one of the beautiful verses that we have in the Quran is to say, well, what do we do with oppressors? The first thing that we do is lovingly educate them that they're oppressing, right? That's our first step, is to, sort of intervene and explain to them in a nice way, like, by the way, we're trying to save you here, but that looking at it as really as a human right, and oppression having nothing to do with marriage, like having absolutely, like, not at all, this has nothing to do with family relationships, and that being one of the ways that we were able to sort of not spin it, but we're able to.
Good point, because it looks like it's the same, and it's not. It has nothing to do with marriage. So
Sharon, did you have another thought? I feel like you're.
Thank you. You're so attentive to my nonverbals. I was reading the chat.
Okay.
But I'm hoping everybody comes back next week, and certainly on the 22nd, because my colleague will explain what we do.
Absolutely. So to Sharon's point, I hope everybody that is on here was able to register for the next two parts of the series on the next 2 Thursdays. The next one will be talking about the Interfaith Coalition, like what it looks like to work together on these issues. What are the successes? How do we do this work? And then the last session will be kind of like a job fair kind of thing. So you'll be able to see a little bit more about like what other organizations do, how do they actualize change, and what does that look like? What is this, a faith-based advocacy stuff that we're doing? So thank you all for joining today. You'll get a recording, and if you want, invite other people to come to the subsequent sessions. And if they want to, they can I can also send them this recording if they want to get the certificate. It'll be up on our website as well. So thank you all again. Sorry, Sharon, you have one last thing?
I did not. So talking about the impact on children. So Ben and I just did a collaborative thing. Anyway, he has 4 webinars available on his website. So maybe we could send those out. But one of them is on the effects on children of growing up in a violent home, and speaking to Deborah's point. So so we invite the interns to check it out. It's an easy listen and very informative.
Absolutely, Ben. If you want to send that to me, I can put it in the follow-up email that they'll get probably tomorrow with this recording.
Okay, cool.
All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Be well, be safe.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.